In the second part on Shakespeare's English history plays, we look at the individual plays. First, we will look at King John. And today we remember King John for signing Magna Carta, or rather putting his royal seal on Magna Carta. We can see the seal here. This picture, the quill on his hand, I think, is a historic inexactness because there was no actual signing. There was the affixing of the royal seal on the charter, granting more rights to the barons. And it happened in the place in the background here. It's Runnymede in England, where the king was stopped by his barons and forced to sign the, or rather approve the document called Magna Carta. Well, that happened in 1215. So we are in the early part of the 13th century, where Shakespeare's first history play happens, which is King John. King John was the son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Henry II was one of the strong kings of England, and the land was supposed to pass on to Richard I. He was the elder son of King Henry II, surviving elder son. He is popularly known as King Richard the Lionheart, Richard Coeur de Lion, the famous hero of many adventurous stories, including Ivanhoe, Robin Hood stories, and he occurs in the novel named Black Arrow, written by Robert Louis Stevenson, and in many other works. But Richard was more into fighting for the Holy Lands in Jerusalem, and he was rarely in the country. And it was John who ruled in his place most often. And John was mockingly called John Lackland because he was not meant to inherit any land. But as fate would have it, he was the de facto ruler of England when Richard was away in doing his crusades. And later, when Richard I died, John became the King of England. And John proved, as history tells us, to be a very ineffective king, and he had trouble with his barons. He had trouble all over. And Shakespeare's play covers the last few years of his life and a few careless things that he does, including the murder of a cousin. And it's not considered to be one of Shakespeare's mature plays. It is one of his earlier plays, but still it has several moments of poetic excellence. And King John is the first in the series of English history plays. And the actual signing of the document is not mentioned by Shakespeare because at that time democracy was not a big deal, and the signing of Magna Carta is not mentioned in Shakespeare's play because Shakespeare's focus was not on that. The second play, as we mentioned, is a set of 4 plays. It's called Tetralogy. We can say this is the first tetralogy in the historic order. And this tetralogy is called the Henrietta Tetralogy because it traces the life and times of Henry V. We hear about Henry in Richard II. We see him a lot in Henry IV Part 1 and 2 as a young prince who is not at all worried about the etiquettes that a prince should follow, who show little promise of becoming a good king, etc. And finally we see him proving his mettle in Henry V. That these 4 plays are called the Henrietta Tetralogy. Tetralogy means a collection of 4 plays, a long story told through 4 parts, 4 plays. And the theme of usurpation, of how Richard II, who is the rightful king, was usurped by Henry IV, and if danger will fall because of that, runs through the particularly Henry IV 2 plays. The first of the tetralogy, and the second play in the series after John. John is a standalone play. Now we are going to look at the 4 plays of the first tetralogy. Henrietta, Richard II, who he was a son of Edward the Black Prince. Edward the Black Prince was a son of Edward III, one of the strongest and mightiest kings England has seen. That was Edward III. And Edward Black Prince had all the fire that his father had, but he died before he became the king. And his son, Richard, became the ruler of England and assumed, and today is known as Richard II. His uncle, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, is an important character in the play. And another uncle, Edmund, who is the Duke of York, is another important character in the play. So you have the families here, the Lancaster family and the York family, who later involve in a family struggle, which leads to a civil war called the Wars of the Roses, the Red Rose and the White Rose. And here, Richard II had a cousin. His name was Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt. And Richard banished Henry from England due to some reason, and Henry came back with forces to get back get back the land that should rightfully be his. But he finds the condition very convenient, and he kind of usurps and he takes over as the next king of England. So that is what happens in Richard II. In the early in the play, we hear we see these lines. Let me read out these lines. These are spoken by the John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, and the father of Henry Bolingbroke. These are some of the most patriotic lines written about England ever, and it goes like this: "This royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, the seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself, against infection and the hand of war, this happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea, which serves it in the office of a wall, or as a moat defensive to a house, against the envy of less happier lands, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England." Spoken by John of Gaunt in bitter pain when he feels that the land is such a blessed plot is being run so badly by Richard II. But soon his son comes and takes over, and that leads to the Henry plays, which are Henry the Fourth Part 1 and 2. Henry the Fourth Part 1 is perhaps the most popular or most widely read of Shakespeare's history plays, English history plays. And in the part 1 and 2, we have many interesting characters. We have Falstaff here. This is Falstaff, and this is Mr. Squiggly, another comic character, a lady. And here you have Dame Dinge, a British actress, acting as Mr. Squiggly. This is a recent 21st century adaptation of the play. And we have such well-formed characters as Falstaff, Mr. Squiggly, Hotspur, again, a very remarkable character that Shakespeare has created, and Prince Hall, the apparently wastrel of a prince who later emerges as King Henry IV. So the Henry plays, Henry IV Part 1 and 2 are very well written, and they are mature plays, considered to be mature plays of Shakespeare, leading to Henry V play, which is again a short play. I mean, a play that covers a short period of time, but presenting Henry V as a very strong and very powerful and very capable young monarch. But unfortunately, we know that he dies young, and then, as perhaps Henry IV feared, the country lapses into civil strife. That happens after Henry V. There is no indication of that in the play. And perhaps the most dramatic moment in Henry V play would be when Henry leads his people to France and wins the battle at Agincourt, where these lines are spoken to inspire his men. When his people are largely outnumbered by the French forces, he is able to win a victory where he inspires his people through his speech. "Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more. Or close the wall up with our English dead. In peace there is nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility. But when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of the tiger stiffen the sinews, summon up the blood. So he manages to summon up the blood of his people, and the Agincourt battle is won. That was in 1415. Perhaps the last glorious thing that Henry V did, because he very soon died of natural causes, leaving the country to his very young, almost a baby son, who was Henry VI. So that takes us to the next tetralogy, which would be Henry VI, part 1, 2, and 3, and Richard III, which between the four plays they covered the Wars of the Roses, signified by the white rose of the York family and the red rose of the House of Lancaster. What happened was Henry VI became king when he was a baby, and he grew up to be a weak king, mentally unstable, and he was usurped and he was brought back to power by different people, power centers that were working within the country. And naturally, there was civil war, which tore the nation apart. And at that time, England was also at war with France. And out of this confusion rose a person. We have Richard II, who was third, was not in line to be king, who capturing power through his machination, and that is traced by the second tetralogy in the chronological order. But in the order in which Shakespeare wrote, this would be the first tetralogy. The Henry the sixth plays together have many characters, including Henry the Sixth, the infirm, insane, partly insane king, who was given to fits of insanity, or rather psychological conditions that were not known at that time, and his queen Margaret of Anjou, and then Joan of Arc, the French hero, appears in this play as a witch character. So this is the English perspective, and they see Joan of Arc as a witch kind of woman. And you have Richard of York, who later emerges as the next king. So Henry the Sixth, part 1, 2, and 3 are plays that cover the war and confusion is captured in the plays. Early plays by Shakespeare, not very mature and not very well crafted. But Richard III, even though an early play, is perhaps very intense particularly because the character of the much debated character of Richard III. And Richard III was a usurping king, and he did not rule for long. And the play is full of bloodshed. It's almost a Senecan kind of play with many murders. Over 10 people are murdered and their ghosts appear, and there are many brutal scenes, including drowning somebody inside a cask of wine. And Richard III is presented as a very gross and brutal villain by Shakespeare. And in history, he was remembered as such. But there were also historians who countered this argument and who believed that he was not as villainous as he was presented, though he did have a kind of crooked aspect to his character. And there still is a society was formed centuries back called the Richard III Society, which did much work to get a more historically accurate image of Richard III as a person and as a king. Well, in 1485, Richard III had his end, where he met a group of soldiers led by Henry Richmond, who later became Henry VII, Henry Tudor, Henry Richmond. At that time he was known as Henry Richmond. And in this area, in the picture, this is the field called Bosworth Field. It's a modern photograph. Around this area, the battle took place. It's called the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, where Richard III, with his enormous croup back, he was a hunchback, fell from his horse, and he stood up and shouted, a horse, my kingdom for a horse." But nobody gave him a horse. Instead, he was cut down and he died in the battlefield. And so in 1485, in the battlefield of Bosworth, somebody picked a crown from a bush and placed it on Henry Richmond's head, and he became known as Henry the Seventh, establishing the Tudor monarchy, combining the two houses, the houses of York and Lancaster, establishing a relatively strong rule which continued. And Shakespeare lived during Elizabeth I, who was the granddaughter of Henry the Seventh. So here we have Benedict Cumberbatch, the British actor, acting as Richard III. And interestingly, Benedict is related to Richard by blood, and it has been proved that he is his 16th, cousin 16 times removed, centuries apart. So DNA evidence and other evidences have proved that Richard Cumberbatch, the actor, is related to Benedict Cumberbatch, is related to Richard III, and fate would have it that he would play the role of his long distant cousin. And there is this interesting picture here. This is called the Grey Friars remains. This is the skeletal remains of Richard III, discovered very recently in 2012, just hardly 8 years back, because Richard was buried after he died in the Bosworth field. He was given a not very ritualistic burial at a local churchyard near Leicester, and soon later on the church was demolished and nobody knew where he was buried. In 2012, Richard III Society and other scientists, archaeologists of the University of Leicester spotted. They did a lot of research and they located his body, skeletal remains, and you can see a bend in his spine here, showing that he did have a hunchback, a condition called scoliosis, and his body was exhumed and it was given a proper burial. Today, Richard III is buried within the Leicester Cathedral in England. So that's the story of Richard III, whose story formed the last play in the Tetralogy series, where Richmond, who later became Henry VII, makes a speech in Richard III play. We will unite the white rose and the red. And here you have the red and the white united. This became the insignia of the Tudor kings. Smile heaven upon this fair conjunction. All this divided York and Lancaster, divided in their dire division. Oh, now let Richmond and Elizabeth is his wife who belonged to the York family, the true succeeders of each royal house, by God's fair ordinance conjoin together, and let their heirs, God, if thy will be. So it's interesting that Richard III, the play, there is no play named Henry VII. This is the actual name of the king. Richard III begins with the words of Richard himself, where he says, now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York. He is referring to his brother Edward, who was then crowned the king, a king from the York family becoming king. But the winter of discontent did not end at that time. And that winter ended with the ascendance of Henry VII. That is the last, that's the ninth of Shakespeare's history plays. And the last history play which he wrote, which was written much later in his career, and along with Fletcher, is Henry VIII, which covers the reign of Henry VIII, father of Elizabeth, how he wanted a divorce from his first wife Catherine of Aragon, and how he got separated from the church run by the Pope, and he married Anne Boleyn, and the play ends with the birth of Elizabeth and the promise that she will one day become a great king, a monarch. So that concludes Shakespeare's history plays. You have from King John to Henry VIII, in between two tetralogies, collection of 4 plays each, Richard II, Henry IV, 1, 2, and 5 forming the first tetralogy, and which is called Henrietta, and then Richard VI, 3 parts, and Henry VI, 3 parts, and Richard III forming the second tetralogy, and Henry VIII as the second standalone play. So that is the brief story of Shakespeare's history plays. There might have been other plays that Shakespeare wrote, including tragedies and comedies, of which we do not have much evidence. He was more of a businessman who ran shows and did not care for his, to assert his authorship. And he also collaborated with many people. And recently, there is a strong argument that there is a play, an anonymous play, which was written during his lifetime, named Edward III, was also largely written by Shakespeare. So there are many Shakespeare scholars who would say that Edward III is also a English history play that Shakespeare wrote. If that can be accepted, the total number of plays, English history plays that Shakespeare wrote, would be 11 in number. Thank you very much.